Hello, so we are in September already. How is it September? I thought I would just do a quick wrap-up of the books that I read in August. I actually read more books in August than I've read in any other month, probably in my life. A lot of those books were Stephen King books, and I think I mentioned in another video that I'm reading all of Stephen King's works in chronological order at the moment. And I will probably do separate videos on Stephen King, so I'm not going to talk very much about the Stephen King books that I've read, but I will tell you which ones I've read. I'll start with this, which is the Bachman books. I actually started reading the Bachman books sometime towards the end of last year when I started this project. I finished this in August. I read 2 stories from the Bachman books, Roadwork and The Running Man. This also features Rage and The Long Walk. So yeah, I won't say too much about them. The other Stephen King books I've read, I actually read a non-fiction work by Stephen King called Danse Macabre, and this edition I have here is the earlier edition. This was republished with, I think, an additional chapter, I think called What's Scary. I haven't read that yet, but I'd quite like to read that. I really enjoyed Danse Macabre. Again, I'm not going to talk a huge amount about it, but this is a really interesting work where Stephen King talks about the horror genre. Horror on radio, horror on television, horror at the movies, and of course horror in literature. And he covers the period roughly 1950 to 1980, which is sort of when he was writing this. He doesn't try to cover all horror works covered in that period. He really narrows his focus onto certain key texts. But that's Danse Macabre. Really enjoyed this. The other one I read was Cujo. I love that cover. You can probably tell what this is about. This is, of course, the rabid dog story, published in 1981, I want to say. Not a particularly long work, mercifully, because I didn't really enjoy Cujo very much. I'll talk about my reasons for that in another video, but it was a bit of a slog. I was kind of glad to be done with it. And then the final Stephen King work that I read in August was The Gunslinger, the first volume in the Dark Tower series. I had read this before, so this was a reread. And it was a slightly different experience second time around. It wasn't that long ago that I actually read it for the first time. It was maybe a couple of years ago. But I guess I had certain expectations going in the first time around. The second time I knew what to expect, so it was a different kind of read. An enjoyable read, I would say. So I'm looking forward to reading the rest of this series. So those are the Stephen King books. I read 3 books that weren't Stephen King books that I want to talk about a little bit more today. One of those, they're actually in 3 different formats. So one of them was a paperback, one of them was an audiobook, and one was an ebook. I'll talk first about the paperback, which is The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton. I'm reading this as part of I was going to say a little project. It's quite a big, ambitious project that I've set myself that I'm not going to talk about yet, but I'll be reading a lot more. Not just Edith Wharton, but works kind of in this sort of period over the coming months. I really enjoyed The Age of Innocence. I was a little bit worried going in that I would find it quite a slog, given that, you know, this is a Norton Critical Edition, and that kind of tells you just how dense this is, in the sense that the language was actually more accessible than I thought it would be. It wasn't particularly difficult to read, but Wharton's writing about old New York, so New York in the 1870s and 1880s, and the society at that time, and she was a part of that society. She grew up in old New York. She knows it very well, and she describes it in intricate detail, which is why the Norton Critical Edition is so useful, because this is full of footnotes, explanatory text, essays, letters, all kinds of different helpful additional stuff to help you understand this. I didn't actually read all that additional stuff. I focused just on reading the text, and I enjoyed the story just for what it was, but I also recognise there is a lot more going on in this than I could glean the first time around, so I will be going back to read all the additional stuff. It's about 400 or 500 pages in this, but the work itself is only 200 pages, so it's not particularly long, really enjoyable. I enjoyed reading about Newland Archer, the wealthy young man of New York in the 1870s, and his kind of conflicting emotions over, on the one hand, being engaged to a similarly wealthy, well-mannered young woman, and kind of gradually falling for the divorcee, well, actually, not a divorcee, the Countess Olenska, who wants to divorce her husband, who's been allegedly treating her very badly, and seems to completely disregard the norms and the rules of society in New York at this time. Doesn't even seem to be aware of these rules and norms, and that really strikes Newland as something that he hadn't, I guess, considered before. It's a fascinating read because there are a lot of emotions under the surface that are kind of hinted at, and very often they only come to the surface when it's kind of too late to act on them, and then that creates a new wave of emotions. So it's a really interesting text. Yeah, it's not a clear-cut critique of New York society at this time. As I said, Edith Wharton was a part of that society. She reserves a certain fondness for it, even though she's also quite blunt about its shortcomings. Really, really good book. Just for the story, just for the characters, it's a great read. Really recommend this. So the other two texts I read, as I said, weren't printed works. One of those was a Kindle book that I read, and this is Donna Zuckerberg's Not All Dead White Men. Now when you hear that name, Donna Zuckerberg, you think, she's not one of those Zuckerbergs, right? It turns out she is one of those Zuckerbergs. She is Mark Zuckerberg's sister. And the premise of this book, I think it grew out of an article that she wrote, might have been for the New Yorker, I'm not entirely sure of the publication, about how the so-called manosphere, so a kind of very loosely knit group of men's rights activists, were quoting classical texts as a means of justifying their worldview and of giving a kind of a semblance of intellectual legitimacy, really, to their worldview, a worldview which is for the most part deeply misogynistic. So she expands on this in this book, and Zuckerberg focuses in particular on the Stoic texts. So Marcus Aurelius's Meditations comes up, which is something I'm actually going to be reading soon, out of curiosity. And she gives a little background to Stoicism and how these particular men, or really a small subset of these men, are using these texts to kind of say, aha, you see, these ideas have been around for a long time. And then Ovid, she talks a lot about Ovid's sort of poetry and how it sort of seems to almost sort of encourage sexual assault of a means of quote-unquote seducing women at this time. And then she talks a little bit more broadly about kind of classical society as these men view it, in their attempt to kind of justify changing society back to what they would believe was a more preferable way of living as a man. There's a very hateful ideology that's emerging at the moment, and in its most extreme incarnation leads to things like the Christchurch massacre that occurred back in March, the very recent El Paso shootings. That violent outburst is rooted in, it really kind of begins with these sort of misogynistic worldviews that sort of mutate into white supremacy and then violent nationalism. So I was interested in kind of reading a bit about where some of this stuff begins and how these people sort of justify these beliefs to themselves with this kind of intellectual veneer of the classics. I don't know if Donna Zuckerberg entirely succeeds in this endeavour. I think it's an interesting subject, But this book, I think, doesn't know whether it wants to be a kind of a learned academic work or more of a kind of generalist popular text. It doesn't really succeed in either camp. It's written to appeal, I think, to a scholarly audience. It has, it has footnotes, it has a bibliography. There's a lot of kind of text analysis going on here, and yet I didn't feel as though it was comprehensive enough to be an academic work. I think if she was striving for a more thorough academic work, then I think this could have done more to look at how the classics have been reappropriated by various different groups to justify kind of ideologies of hatred. Instead, she focuses almost exclusively on the Red Pill subreddit forum. I think if this was going to be a more popular journalist work, it would have worked better if she'd taken a more journalistic view, where she'd kind of talked a little bit more about the responses that she was getting in researching this, which she does touch on from time to time, and her kind of personal journey, if you like, as she was discovering these sorts of views and acquainting herself with them. And the final book I read was, I didn't read, I listened to, was the audiobook, Why We Get the Wrong Politicians by Isabel Hardman. Isabel Hardman writes for The Spectator, which is a more right-leaning political magazine in the UK. She has fantastic access to MPs, to the kind of political world that she's writing about here. She's a lobby journalist, so she works in a little kind of clique of journalists who have access to politicians and their special advisors and the sort of inner workings of Parliament. And in the first part of this book, she talks about the politician's journey, really, from seeking to be selected by their local party to run for office, right through to being kicked out of Parliament in a general election. It's a very bleak view. To run as an MP, you need a hell of a lot of money. It costs tens of thousands of pounds to run as an MP. You don't really get a lot of support from the parliamentary party that you're kind of running under the banner of. People generally hate you because you're an MP and nobody likes MPs. There's no guarantee that you will be elected, and then if you're not elected, you've got this enormous debt. Even if you are elected, you then come into Parliament and it's a huge shock because nobody really explains to you how the thing works. And then in order to get ahead in Parliament, really all you ought to be doing is voting the way the party whip tells you to vote, because then eventually you might make it to the executive and then you have some kind of influence, although not as much influence as you think that you might have. Whereas if you actually spend your time scrutinising legislation and being critical of the bills that come before you, if your own party is in government, then that's frowned upon, because you should just be doing whatever the party wants you to do. If you're in opposition, it's futile because you don't have a majority, so there's nothing you can do about it. It's pretty bleak, and a lot of members of Parliament turn to alcohol. Many of them have mental health problems. Parliament, being a parliamentarian, either drives you towards a bottle or drives you into states of depression, or if you already had issues, will exacerbate them. It's not a good place to work, it's not a healthy environment to work in, and everybody in the public hates you. And Isabel Hardman kind of confronts that attitude, that public sort of disillusionment with Parliament head on, and says, yes, politicians are to blame in large part for this. There was, of course, the expenses scandal in 2008, where they were doing things they should never have been doing, and they did it because they knew they could get away with it. But on the other hand, there are many parliamentarians who are very well-meaning and work very hard, but that counts for nothing in many cases if the mood of the public is against that particular party that they work for. They don't stand a chance. The second part of the book looks a bit more at how Parliament fails as an institution, how bad laws are passed or how good laws aren't passed. She uses Grenville as an example. She uses the Health and Social Care Act that the coalition government back in sort of 2011 were trying to pass, and eventually did pass, although the thing was just an overly complex mess. And she just talks about how things get to the point that they do. She doesn't talk very much about Brexit, because Brexit was still kind of playing out in its earliest stages when she wrote this book. but she does mention Brexit as being another symptom of a dysfunctional parliament. And if you follow British politics at all right now, you will know that things have gotten so far out of hand. And it makes a much more sense to me why things have got so far out of hand, having read this book. I was in equal parts appalled by the system, and I think sympathetic towards the people who work in that system as well. Many of them are grotesque, really. Others are pitiful in a way. So it's a very interesting book. I highly recommend it. Isabel Hodman reads the text herself on Audible. She reads it very well. I really recommend it if you're at all interested in British politics, or generally in why politics doesn't work right now. I recommend this book. So there you go. I read quite a lot in August. I read a lot of Stephen King. I have to admit I'm getting a little sick of Stephen King now, and I probably will pause my Stephen King project soon. And yeah, there you go. So I look forward to seeing you soon.